Welcome to the first online seminar organized by Media for Future. Media for Future is a collaborative initiative that connects scientists and journalists from different European countries to strengthen climate communication, to raise public awareness, and hopefully it can also inspire meaningful action. My name is Magdalena Schanf, and I am here as a member of the Deutsche Toleranzstiftung. As you might have heard a minute ago, we will be recording this meeting. And if anyone does not want to be filmed or recorded, you're welcome to just shut your camera and then we won't see you. And I will also ask you to mute your microphones. If you have questions, you are very welcome, and we hope that you have lots of questions to ask those, but please write them in the chat. Carolina will herself be following the chat, and she will then be able to maybe cluster the questions, and we will then be able to respond. But it would be too complicated to have everyone join in speaking. So let me come back to our event. This is a new series of online seminars, and it is dedicated to exploring how journalism, science, and in this case, art and storytelling can meet the challenges of the climate era. How we can communicate complexity without losing clarity and urgency without losing hope. And today we begin with a perfect guest to open that conversation, Harriet Rix. Thank you very much for being here. Harriet is a British biochemist and author whose work bridges the worlds of scientific research on the one hand and narrative craft on the other. She has spent years studying how trees and forests shape the living systems of our planet, how they regulate water cycles, build soils, create microclimates, and influence the chemistry of the atmosphere itself. Her latest book, The Genius of Trees: How Trees Mastered the Elements and Shaped the World, is both a scientific exploration and a literary journey. It takes us from the mangroves of Brazil, which are beautiful, by the way, to the cedar forests of Syria, the Himalayan foothills, and the volcanic landscapes of the Canary Islands. Through vivid storytelling, Harriet shows us that trees are not passive background to the drama of life. On the contrary, they're active engineers of ecosystems and perhaps our most powerful allies in confronting climate change. But what I find makes Harriet's work so compelling, especially for those of us in journalism, is how she writes about science with both precision and wonder. She reminds us that communicating climate and nature is not only about conveying data, information, but also about rekindling connection. And she helps us readers find awe, empathy, and responsibility toward the non-human nature. And in an age where environmental news can feel overwhelming, I think most of us just yesterday, we heard about the increasing rate of carbon dioxide emissions, the highest ever. Voices like Harriet's offer a different model, one that invites understanding through curiosity, not fear, through relationship and not abstraction. So today we'll be talking not only about trees and their astonishing genius, but also about what it means to write about the natural world, to balance accuracy and imagination, to translate research into story, and to use language as a bridge between science and society. Please join me in welcoming Harriet Rix. Unfortunately, we won't have time today to explore the book in full detail, but Harriet and I thought that it would be nice if she started out with sharing a short excerpt with us. And afterwards, we can then start in on the dialogue. Harriet, you have the floor.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to meet so many people from so many organizations and so many parts of the world. And it's a real joy to be here. And it's lovely to meet Asta, whose work I have now seen online. And who I admire hugely. I was going to start by reading an extract from chapter 7 of The Genius of Trees. Ah, dear, I thought this might happen. It's merging with the trees in the background. It's also available in German for those who are interested. Genial Baum, published by DTV, and it's coming out in Japan, South Korean, Polish.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. Maybe we could put that information into the chat.
Yes, that
as well
good.
For us to
Okay,
have.
great. So the end of chapter 7, trees shaping animals, and this is just trying to evoke a response, but in our souls, really, in our guts, about the way that the chemistry that we share with the rest of the natural world is something that developed in parallel, but then because we eat, interact with, and work with other members of the natural world, that chemistry is still being interchanged, even though evolutionarily our chemistries have split. We're still working together. It doesn't matter whether, oh, and I'm so sorry, I should just say the first quote is from a lady called Lynn Margulis, who whose theory of endosymbiosis, that in some ways cells will go into other cells and thereby massively increase their ability to do wonderful things chemically. Her writings were transformative, and I really recommend that you read all of them. That could perhaps also go in the chat, maybe just her name for spelling purposes, if that's possible. Right. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether you compare kangaroos, bacteria, humans, or salamanders, said Lynn Margulis. We all have incredible chemical similarities. To this, we might add that we have incredible similarities with trees. In short, although there are many tiny, shuddering variations in the ways trees respond to being bitten, the broad outline has been going strong for 200 million years, and it includes emitting volatile organic compounds. This is hugely significant because it means there's a basis for tree-animal interactions that is almost impossibly old, older than the hills, older than the continents, as old as dinosaurs, and trees communicating damage to other trees, or perhaps a handy predator, is part of that ancient interaction. So why and how have trees shaped animals when it could have been the other way round? The answer can be seen in a collection of fossils in Germany, the famous Messel pit. 47 million years ago, it was a lake surrounded by subtropical rainforest, the new multi-layered broadleaf forest which had taken over after the Chicxulub asteroid had annihilated the dinosaurs and dislodged the conifers. Global warming over 10 million years had allowed vegetation to boom, and the overall effect would have been not unlike what happened on the shores of the Amazon. When carbon dioxide seeped over the lake and into the surrounding forest around it, it killed a selection of animals that would not look completely out of place in the Brazilian rainforest today. Their perfect preservation shows that animals, particularly mammals, evolved in response to the rise of angiosperms, the broadleaf trees, and the encroaching jungle in a remarkably short slice of evolutionary time. Among the fossils is a bat, which shows evidence of flight and flaps of skin, large ears, which show it has quickly evolved to echolocate its way through dense forest. Another rapidly evolving mammal has developed an opposable thumb, one of the first examples of an animal that had evolved to climb trees. Assessing the two speeds of evolutionary change against each other shows that the primary producers, the trees in this situation, were driving the changes. The trees were essentially in a lower gear, driving the change forward, while animals in a higher gear responded to it physically with remarkable and remarkably quick plasticity. But although animals physically accommodate themselves to trees, trees are devious in the substances they produce. Many of these substances mimic a hormone, block an element of the central nervous system, or, like nutmeg, suffocate the animal to death at a cellular level. Few are targeting humans or even primates specifically. They are blanket poisoning herbivores. Targeting, however, is exactly what Theobroma cacao, the cocoa tree did, using theobromine, or food of the gods, the active ingredient and distinctive taste in chocolate. The tree was isolated in a kidney-shaped niche around Ecuador during the last ice age, about 21,000 years ago. But after the world started to heat up, the tree spread out of its refuge astonishingly quickly, becoming a crop plant across South America and a form of currency for the Mayan civilization. This happened because theobromine, like cocaine, caffeine, and nicotine, is a ring alkaloid, a ring of carbon and nitrogen, which fits neatly into adenosine nerve receptors. It has a mild but pleasurable effect on the nervous system, which makes it irresistible to primates. They get, to a greater or lesser extent, a psychoactive high, which allows them to swing through the canopy for miles. This is essential for a tree that can only grow in specific niches that are scattered about the forest and likely to be a long distance from one another. Ruthlessly, the trees select for larger monkeys able to travel further distances by using the toxicity of theobromine. Just as chocolate can kill dogs, so too large a dose would knock off a small monkey. To ensure that bigger animals can eat the seeds, the trees are monoecious, producing separate male and female flowers on the same tree. And the female flowers grow directly on the trunk and larger branches, rather than on the ends of delicate new shoots, by a process called cauliflory. The flowers are pollinated by midges, and large, heavy pods can then develop without breaking branches on the parts of the tree that can support the weight of larger monkeys. These large monkeys can eat the pods and turn the very high fat content of cocoa butter into the physical energy required to travel long distances, and the theobromine hit into mental energy and spread the seeds. The use of theobromine as a drug to encourage monkeys to travel harder and faster seems a world away from the ways that other trees spread their flowers. However, the tree is using its extraordinary powers of chemical synthesis to manipulate the animals it will use to travel. It's like a car factory, producing machines of various designs that enable people to travel distances infinitely further than they could alone. But it's a design process that started out of shared basics of life and biochemistry. Chemically, physically, and existentially, animals have been shaped by trees, and, with the possible exception of the sloth, no animal has been more shaped by trees than humans ourselves. Sorry, I realized there was a middle bit which I should have cut out. Just as I was reading it, I was reading the wrong book. Thank you. Questions, maybe. Magdalena, I can't hear you. Your microphones.
Thank you. I had muted myself. Thank you so much, Harriet. I don't think you should have cut anything out, because I once again realized how closely related I am to those monkeys and how the theobromine is irresistible to me, except that stores are easier. Chocolate is more easily accessible now. And to our audience, I would really like to encourage everyone to read this book. It gave me so much pleasure. And in a different chapter, Harriet writes about a female scientist who I think is published for the first time in the Académie Parisienne, or Paris Academy. And you quote her as saying that she reads lyrically Émilie du Châtelet. And I would like to make that compliment to you. It is really, in the beginning, it was a little inhibiting to me, who I'm not a scientist, but one reads the book, it is so pleasurable. So
thank you so much. I'll have to find Voltaire so I can be known in the future as the lover of a great man like she was, forgotten for science and remembered.
But I am going to launch into our conversation now. That's okay. And I would like to start out with a couple of questions, Harriet.
Yeah, wonderful.
What would you say is needed to write about trees, about nature, about climate? Is it precision? Is it wonder? Is it both? Is it something else? How do you do it?
It's a really interesting question because I think some people do it so well by simple observation, simple description. But of course, no description is ever a flat description. You know, a flat description can never work for other people. So what I found myself doing was thinking, I want to express myself like this. What can I find scientifically? I mean, I'm afraid I probably wrote the book totally in the wrong way round, totally the wrong way around, because I read some scientific paper that sort of piqued my interest. And the thing about scientific papers is they're so often so narrow. You know, you read some tiny, fascinating detail and you think this is absolutely amazing. I'll go and see this tree. I must go and see this tree. It's absolutely extraordinary. And then you think, but this is so interesting from an evolutionary point of view. Why would a tree evolve in that direction? How did that help the tree survive? And then you have to find all the other papers which are sort of hidden in, journals in a million different languages. Which will help you shape that idea. So what I find myself doing, and I think I don't know who else does this. I've never met anyone else who does this, but I think everyone must. I find myself writing down the facts as they are, and then thinking, okay, how can I transform this into a story which has cohesion and flow rather than all these different voices that are coming through from the scientific researchers? Because the world of science is so fragmented, because people are using different instruments to find out what they want to know, and they're using they're thinking about chemicals, or they're thinking about ecological large patterns of movement, or they're thinking about mass numbers or physics. You get all these sort of little hints which are shining in different directions, and it can be really dazzling. It's like the sort of facets on a diamond. The light comes at you from all sorts of different directions, and you can have real problems piecing it together in a way which isn't sort of completely overwhelming for a reader, I think, because there are so many different facets of things which don't fit together until you've sort of forced them together.
So you create a sort of mosaic, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what I tend to do is write down the mosaic and then think, well, this is no good. This makes no sense at all. It's a mosaic, but all the pieces are different, like a patchwork rug, where you haven't given any thought to the color scheme as you go in, which somehow works with patchwork rugs, but I'm just not sure it does with writing. And so then you have to be an impressionist and kind of squiggle over the top, or at least that's what I try to do. I put on some vague paint colors. Yeah. But precision also, I think, because people love precision so much, I think putting in precise details is so important, but you have to put them in your tenor. So I spent so long trying to convert, numbers of amounts of carbon sequestered by trees into something that would fit in within the concept I was writing about. So how much coal, how many trees would have to grow for how long if they were 20 years old to make that amount of coal in which they found this giant butterfly. How you spend a lot of time translating numbers into a similar scale, because otherwise, again, I think people find that they're, and reading as a relaxation. It should be such a relaxation. So I don't think people want to feel constantly dizzy and bemused and headachy because they're trying to jump between different scales and so on. I think that's the author's job. That's what we're paid for. That's me.
And that's what you do. I mean, you translate these numbers, you translate the facts, you translate the chemistry, you translate them into stories about trees. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that telling these stories, giving the trees agency in our imagination, giving them agency, is that itself a form of ecological restoration?
I love this question. I think it's really brilliant. I hope so, because I think if we could reintegrate humans into the natural world, then we would be partway there. If every child felt truly bonded to one tree, I think we wouldn't have nearly so many problems in the world. And so, ecologically speaking. So, yes, I see And also, of course, I think it's been one of the massive problems of nationalism that people have lost sight of their of the commonality of trees and the commonalities of nature. So nationalism, for some reason, or ecological subjects for some reason very easily become nationalistic. They very easily become sort of my patchy. And I've never worked out why this is. It makes to me no sense. But I think it is something to do with the fact that this oak tree behind me is very close to where I live. It belongs to my next door neighbor who's a farmer. And I remember, him coming into our kitchen. He was the local digger man who operated the digger. And he would come in and eat chocolate biscuits and have a cup of tea and tell stories about this wood. And I think everyone, or most people, have that patch. They have a tree that they know the story of. And then they have the rest of the world's trees, which look different and are confusing. And I think if we can read more of those stories about the rest of the world's trees, then obviously we have more of a united front when it comes to restoring things ecologically, and also it stops this sort of terrible destructive need for everything to be universal, for us all to sequester carbon by planting eucalyptus plantations, which I think is a terrible thing, or monoculture plantations, and makes people really, really so much more aware of the way that every tiny gradation of soil will present humans with a different ecosystem which they have to understand before they can help. And of course, the best way to do that is always with stories, I think. I think it's a very interesting thing. I used to tutor maths and science, and it was fascinating how few people can truly understand science through a mathematical lens, I think, or how few children find that easy. Rather, I think that's a better way of putting it. There are people who find science through maths incredibly easy, and they're very, very lucky, I think. But I think they're a minority still, and maybe that's because of our bad maths education, or maybe it's just that humans really love stories and find them very compelling.
So love stories and love this connection that you were just describing by having people creating and developing a connection to trees. While you were speaking, I was just thinking of several examples in countries around the Mediterranean and in Africa as well, and the Western Africa, the Atlantic coast. I know that there are many projects where they take young parents, to plant a tree for their child, with the idea of the child then growing up and going to visit that tree and creating a relationship. And I always find it so interesting that in many of those countries, the ones that I know best in this case are Spain and Ghana, nonetheless, there is the love for this tree, but at the same time, there is so much pollution and such a lack of awareness for protecting the environment their children grow up in. So we need more stories.
Yeah, and it's a very odd thing because people are completely capable of being extremely proud of trees and then also having, a wasteland next door to that tree. And I've never worked out again why the connections don't happen. But I think, again, it's and perhaps it's a lack of scientific education. I don't know. That's one reason I'm so keen to try and put chemistry into stories about trees, because I think with more of a chemical understanding, it becomes much easier to understand the sort of commonalities between environmental peculiarities, something like that.
Well, then let's get into a little bit more of detail there. How do you think that popular writing, including chemistry, including science, how can that influence public awareness on the one hand, but also how can that influence the scientific discourse, which is also important?
Yeah, and the political discourse, which is also really important at the top level. Yeah, it's a very delicate balance. Often, I think there are the classic example is the World Wide Web. The Wood Wide Web, I beg its pardon, the Wood Wide Web, which was such a wonderful idea, is such a wonderful idea, and which so many people, I think there has been a backlash because so many people now passionately believe that every tree in a wood is connected to another by a mushroom. And And I get asked this the whole time, surely every tree has a mycelium network with it. And that's not actually the case. Trees can exist without mycelium networks. They're weaker, they're not as able to adapt. It's much harder. But the idea of the wood wide web was such a beautiful one that I think it spread so fast that it sort of overwhelmed the science. And that is fine until you have people losing faith in science and losing faith in what truth might mean, and what and sort of maybe anthropomorphizing trees too far, and then not really understanding how they can be protected. So sorry, where was I going with that? Yes, so I think the thing of making science accessible, which will nearly always use metaphor or generality or some form of romanticization often, which I don't think is a bad thing at all. I think it's totally necessary and really important to have these very vivid stories. But I think it has to be balanced with a sort of real grasp at the basics, which often people who are writing about them will leave out, because, I mean, yeah, it happens, I think, in any situation where you're writing about science, and the sort of basics can seem a little schooly unless you're very clever with them. And so I think it's really important to focus on making the basics incredibly interesting and incredibly scientific, and then the story can be interpreted in the light of the science. So I think hand in hand, it's the most magical combination. I remember there was a professor of poetry when I was studying biochemistry at Oxford. He was a wonderful man called Geoffrey Hill, who writes these great thunderous poems. And he had a long beard and dressed in black and looked just like a poet should be. And he gave a lecture in which he said something like, the next Oxford professor, he had a very deep voice, the next Oxford professor of poetry is sitting in a laboratory hating us all. And so I was very impressed, because I'd skipped my laboratory to go and listen to his lecture. And I said to him, why did you say this? Was this just a throwaway comment because you had to fill up an hour? And he said, no, not at all. I just think that the language of science is so rich, so unexplored, that when it truly comes into its own in literature, there'll be a revolution in the same way that there was, when religious language entered poetry at various stages in the past. And I thought that was such a beautiful thing to say. He was sort of interpreting it in the same way as the Persians would have looked at the language of sensuality. And very, very early on, he was looking at scientific language as the sort of really beautiful and creative thing it is. Lots of people working together to kind of knit a language together. And I think that's a wonderful thing for a writer. But yeah, I do think it has to be philosophically grounded in some sort of epistemological basis, because otherwise it can, and it's a really interesting thing that people don't feel the need. If you were writing a life of Napoleon and you suddenly went off piste, and suddenly Napoleon found himself in the Bahamas, and and you suddenly went off piste, then people would be a little taken aback. Whereas with trees, when people are writing about, or with science, when people are writing true facts about science, they don't seem to need the same boundary marking the difference between lies and truth. People are often very, very happy writing about science in a very, the classic example is the overstory, which sticks to the science nearly always, and then suddenly will go off on something completely unscientific, and completely unproven, completely kind of untested within a scientific context. I find it very confusing, and I think lots of other people do as well. So I think, yeah, it's obviously fiction about science is also a really important way to engage people with science. But how do we then draw the line between truth and lies?
And
Yeah.
and fake news or lies.
But
what about in the other direction? I mean, do you sometimes have discussions with scientists or with policymakers where they I don't know, where they question the way you communicate about science because it's not scientific enough or the like? Does that ever happen?
I've been really lucky it hasn't happened yet, touch wood. But I'm sure it will one day. Someone will take me up on it, and yeah, that was why I wrote so many footnotes, because I was trying to not let that happen. And it's a really good way of, because I did discover at various times I'd been writing happily, and and I just made up something wonderful, and then I couldn't find and I'm sure I'd read it somewhere. And I think it happens a lot. It happens to anyone who um writes that you somehow think that there's a quote there. You're sure you remember it, and sometimes it's just what has been made up in your mind. But also there are a couple of things that I put in my book which are, touching the impossible, or touching the real limits of what has been proven. So I have a theory about a giant sloth, and the Joshua Tree in Joshua Tree National Park, and how the giant sloth once had these moths that clung to its fur, and then when it became extinct, the moths had to go off and join the trees. And that's completely unproven, but I tried to flag up whenever that happened, and so far no one's attacked me on it. So but I'm bracing. It's only a matter of time. And no one has said you shouldn't generalize. I think it's partly that scientists are feel very defensive about how badly they've communicated science. So I think they feel that they've drawn this curtain, drawn this veil between them and other people.
Them.
Yeah, I think they feel often criticized by the fact that they're not communicating well enough. Partly because they don't want to, partly because they are people who, botany is a really good example of this. You have so many people who they don't want to be in cities. That's a really big thing. They don't want to come into a city. They have absolutely no wish to go to London and tell everyone what they've discovered, because they just don't like cities. And so they've been, and they prefer trees to humans, which is completely understandable. And so they have been sitting in a wood for the last 20 years and, taking notes and writing things down and so on. But they just have no wish to communicate that. And so I think, yeah, that's also, but someone like Jane Goodall, who died recently, is a really beautiful example of what can happen when you communicate things well as well. So I think scientists really want to have their ideas communicated, and as a result, they'll put up with some shoddiness, which perhaps they shouldn't. I think they're often too tolerant in the way their ideas are communicated, and don't pull people up hard enough when they
in Germany you talk about ivory towers, that intellectuals or academics like staying in their ivory tower and cannot descend to talk to the plebs, to the people. And then there are other people who like to stay in the woods or in some fjord near the glaciers in Iceland or the like. But as part of our project, we are trying to have this to bridge this communication, and you'll see in a minute why I'm mentioning Iceland. But I would like to ask you one more question, Harriet. If your readers take one message from your book, from The Genius of Trees, what message would you want that to be?
It would be that trees are not humans, and there's no way that we should try and think of them as humans. We should absolutely identify with their value, but we should never, ever, ever try and force them into a human bracket. So my example to any reader who wants to remind themselves that trees are not humans is that the oldest trees and the wisest and the best, and however you want to look at it, the trees with the most genius in the world will put roots down into their heartwood and digest. They will eat their own fungally infected heartwood. So they will encourage fungus to digest their heartwood. Then they will take up those nutrients again in order to grow and evolve into something. And that is just so, the idea that trees will eat their own hearts is just what we should remember whenever we think that trees are like us, because they're really not. And that's what I would like people to remember, as well as the fact that they shape the world.
Emphasizing trees, admiring trees, but not humanizing them.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Harriet.
Thank you so much
for taking us on this journey and giving us a little bit of an insight through the life of trees, and for showing us how science and storytelling can come together to deepen our understanding and to raise our awareness as well. As we move further along, I'd like to open our conversation out a little wider toward art and participation and the ways we as media makers, as journalists, as communicators can help people not only to know about nature, but maybe also to feel part of nature, us human beings being part of non-human nature as well. And to help us do that, I am delighted to introduce Ásthildur Jónsdóttir. She's an Icelandic artist, a researcher, a curator, and an educator who has spent many years exploring the relationship between people, place, and the environment. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for inviting me to be with you. So to make it easy, I'm always called Asta. You can think of Hasta la vista, just the Asta part.
So Asta holds degrees from the University of Iceland and the New York University and the University of Lapland. If I understood correctly, you've taught for many years at the Iceland University of Arts, but now you're currently living in Geneva in Switzerland.
Sorry, I haven't really updated my webpage. I'm currently living in Helsinki now, but kind of working between Helsinki and Iceland.
Okay, so I guess Switzerland was a different jaunt.
Yes, yeah, but with a lot of trees also, like Finland.
And Asta's work focuses on artistic actions, I think also for sustainability, for community-based and participatory art and place-based education, we can call it, with a goal of finding a balance between human well-being and the integrity of non-human nature. And through her installations of collaborative projects, Asta invites people to engage directly with their surroundings, to experience significance and connection through shared action. And Asta's work reminds us that sustainability is not only a scientific or a political challenge, but also a cultural and an emotional one. That's something we were talking about, Harriet, a minute ago. So, Asta, it's a pleasure to have you with us. You have worked at the intersection of art, ecology, and education for many years. So we thought it would be really interesting to have you join in this conversation, and maybe you could tell us how you see artistic and narrative practices, like the kind of storytelling that Harriet develops, that she just described to us. How is that contributing to public understanding of environmental change? And what kind of collaborations or emerging voices give you hope for how these stories are being told today?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much, Harriet, for your inspiring reading from your book. And I really look forward to purchase your book and read it. I think our problem today is that we are so disconnected. So currently I have 2 exhibitions on, so I kind of decided to make a little PowerPoint to share with you. Both of those exhibitions are connected to trees. As I live between Helsinki and Iceland, I'm facing a very different connection to trees. Here in Helsinki, 70% of Finland is covered with trees, but in Iceland, only 2% of our land is covered with trees. So, and that is something that we are really trying to change. When the settlers came to Iceland a long time ago, the country was covered with trees. And there are people that are trying to change this again. And this is the installation I have now in Borgarnes called Changes in the Northern, part of a research group called Changes in the Northern Shores. And my installation is called Roots of Resilience. And in this installation, I'm kind of shedding a light. It doesn't show it perfectly, but I'm working with a farmer called Baldwin, and he is trying to regrow birds in Iceland. And this is pretty much like storytelling, the way I'm telling his story. This is the way the land begins when he is working with the land in Iceland. And slowly it becomes like this. He's showing me this little plant that has grown there. And here he is taking me with a journey through the birch woods, because he is not only a birch farmer or someone that is regrowing birch trees, but he's also a sheep farmer. And he was telling me and showing me how this can go hand in hand, being a sheep farmer and someone that is really trying to bring the land back to its original form. And he is, oh, sorry, this is somehow went on its own. And I think it's, if I just end with his quote, which I think is so beautiful. He says, basically, it's all about restore. Now, this is part, yeah. I cannot see, but you can read it because your faces are on top of his quotes here. Because it's, as he says, it should be in all of our nature that people should bring the land in better conditions than it was when they took it over. So in the installation, I also create settings for people to become a birch tree. So those are branches of birches that had been cut. So, and I got play school children to paint them for me in the colors of an artist that really used birch woods as inspirations. And instead of having a mirror, you're seeing your own shadow, and it becomes playful, and people could leave messages to humans in the name of the birch tree. So they were imagining. And sometimes I had like events to help them to be more imaginative and giving them birch snuffs here, helping them with their imagination, putting themselves in the shoes of the birch. But I also created a sculpture from paper and soil, where it's a birch collector, so people can come and get those boxes where you can collect birds. And then in the end, all of this, so the exhibition ends now in November, and then people can bring, so we will, all the schools in the area, this is located in a museum called in a town called Borgarnes, and we will give the sheets that have been collected for continuing the process. I'm also exhibiting here in Helsinki in the Hungarian Cultural Center. And I got to know a Hungarian man and was offered to exhibit. He's a craftsman, and he makes turns woods. So here he is making a bowl out of curly birds. In the installation, I drew images of leaves from plants that grow, from trees that grow between the exhibition space or the cultural center to my home, and it's around 20 minutes walk. And I also kind of, my idea is that you become a friend. So I'm introducing the audience to my friends that I have kind of made during my stay here in Helsinki. I also selected, as I was working with people from Finland, Iceland, and Hungary, I decided to work with 3 trees. I work with a acai tree in Hungary, which is the oldest tree in Budapest, Swedish white beam in Iceland, and old oak here in Helsinki. And I made here oak crowns also, so you could where the Vera oak, so you could be Vera birch in made the same playfulness, and I wrote a letter to the trees that I'm representing here. And I also created like an embroidery table where I meet people and discuss the nature and the challenges we are facing. And from all the different woodworks, around 300 different bowls, I stacked them instead of showing them as individual pieces. I stacked them, and like in this case, this is nine different casted pieces from the gentleman, that is the craftsman that I'm showing with. And I also created kind of different sensory elements, like here you can smell the birds and create a dialogue. But what is probably of most interest to you is this participatory work, where I worked with 52 students, art education students, and they answered those questions. And so they made a special connection to a tree. And I was asking, do you want to touch the tree? How does it feel? Does it feeling have a color? Can you imagine how the tree looks in different seasons and so on? So it's not scientific facts, but this is ideas for them to spark curiosity. Some of them answered with written text, some with images. But the front page of those 15 pages that each and every one gave in is a reply letter from me to each student, where they are, where I'm kind of telling them how much I like each and every contribution. But as Maxine Green says, the difference between science and art, because I think it's so nice how Harriet is on the between working as an artist and scientist. Maxine Green, who is a great influencer in education, she said, the arts cannot change the world, but they may change human beings who might change the world. And I think this is something we should all kind of try to think of. Maybe you are too scared, Harriet, scared of that people, to have all those footnotes. I mean, you can't just allow yourself to take a stand with the tree, or, and if we think of artistic research, which is a form that I think would be very good for you in our future practices, it's very interesting to think of it as an art research. It's exploratory, not always conclusive. So we don't have to be conclusive. The aim is not to say yes or no, but is to bring more questions or more, focus on process. There we are focusing, if we are able to create settings so the readers become more curious or interested in nature, we have...
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, Asta, because I have had the privilege of reading the book, The Genius of Trees, and it is very much inducive to asking questions. And sometimes there are very clear yes and no answers, but very often it leads us on paths and opens up, to me, very many new questions.
Yeah, but wonderful.
Thank you so much for sharing your approach. And I thought it was quite interesting, because what Harriet was saying at the end is, let's be careful and not humanize trees. And then the example that you showed us was that you were humanizing trees.
Yeah.
In a very different approach. You didn't turn trees into human beings, but human beings into trees. And I wanted to give Harriet an opportunity to respond to this presentation that we just saw.
Well, yes, I was so struck by that, because I thought, yes, of course, this is exactly it. The whole reason I think science is so important in one way is I think it makes our observations so much more acute and so much more intense. But then I was thinking, of course, what else does that? Art. This is exactly what artists are doing the whole time, having that curiosity towards the natural world, which which is a sort of a very fierce and a very serious and a very concentrated one, as well as an open-ended one. So I suddenly wished I hadn't said that, because I thought, or no, not wished I hadn't said that, but I wished I had said that because science always grows out of observation, even though we pretend it doesn't. And I was very much trying to link the science that has been published back to the observation that the way a tree looks. I thought I was really struck by what you said about observation, because I thought this is exactly it. This is what people need, probably, to make them into those observers, whether they come at it, whichever direction they come at it from, whether they need to know its name or not,
Yeah. Maybe it's not necessary to know this is a bird or this is an oak, but what is important to have the platform of, like they were doing in the participatory project that I created with so they were writing, intense letters to the tree, but some of it was in an imaginary language, not in a language, but in something that they believed that would more transformative for the tree. So it is not necessarily, but I think what I was trying to make them also do, and encouraging people to do, instead of make the birds become human, but how is it to be a bird? Where is it? And the birch tree in Iceland is very different from birch tree anywhere else, as it is much smaller tree.
Yeah,
the temperatures. I would like to open the conversation even a little bit further. We had said in the beginning that people should write their questions in the chat. Unfortunately, that does not seem to be working. We don't have a chat. Martha's shaking her head as well. So if anyone has a question that they would like to ask right now, I would ask you to please raise your virtual hand so that I can see you. I am changing over to the other pages. I don't see a hand right now.
Mario?
Yes, thank you. It's just for letting you know, if you want to get back to the original situation, you can write questions on, we saw in Portuguese P and R, so I think you should have a Q&A in your...
I don't.
Should be the second icon on the top.
Raise your hand as the second icon.
Okay.
But I get the impression, I mean, you just raised your hand, Mario, nobody else has, so maybe we don't have to artificially invite our audience.
There's one. There's one now.
So maybe, Harriet, I ask you, have you ever thought of working with an artist approaching different audiences?
Well, I once wrote a chapter for a book about nature printing, and that I found very interesting because it had totally shaped the way that the scientific research had gone. But nature printing is an interesting one because it's half, I obviously it's art, but it's also, it's on the edge of art, I would say, in some senses. But apart from that, no, I have never really. I've occasionally written about the trees in art, but it's always been a very sort of, and I end my book actually with Van Gogh's tree roots, which he used as the sort of great metaphor of what life means at the bottom. But no, I have never truly collaborated with an artist. Yeah, I wonder whether I'd be any good at it.
Sure.
I'd love to find out, but I wonder whether I'd be too literal minded or something. Because you mentioned birch, and I think moose, because moose love birch so much, and they care so much about where it's grown. So each birch for them has a different taste, and so on. But of course, which is a lovely idea, a moose pattern between different birches. But yeah.
Well,
I had a question for you in return. I believe that Icelandic has lots of exciting words for nature, which other languages don't. Do you find that you feel more expressive about nature and more able to communicate what your art is about in Icelandic versus other languages? Or do you find that art is always the way you're communicating and you don't need language at all?
No, I think I use language a lot in my art making. Participatory art requires communication, and obviously having Icelandic as my mother tongue, I'm much more comfortable and have much richer vocabulary because our language, even just in our everyday life, everything is about the weather and the nature. It's very embedded in our language.
Yeah, I'm very envious because I think the lack of good nature words, particularly when it comes to things like genius and agency, and it's so hard separating those from humans. It's so hard putting those onto non-human nature.
But there is quite interesting, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, the Green School movement, which is has this new or for several years they have had the project called Young Environmental Reporters. And that is a project where they create, so youngsters, I think it goes up to 18 years old. They're supposed to write reports on nature, and they can have it either just a written text or an artwork. So I think it's a very exciting project, and I think more schools should, focus on projects like that. And at least in Iceland, it is quite popular, but I think maybe the mistake there in Iceland is that you have to pay a little sum to be part of the Green School movement. I don't know how it is in other countries, but I was on a board in the evaluating the art part a few years ago, and it was fantastic.
Sounds great. Sounds really great. But it's not like a forest school. It's much more sort of.
No, it is like I encourage you to look it up on this Green School movement, and it is.
I think the Green Classroom movement, which is I know it from African countries and not from Iceland, so I think it's really an international movement.
It is international.
That exists, yes.
Yeah.
I am looking at the time, and we are actually coming to an end for our of our event. But I really want to thank you very much.
I'm so sorry. Someone just raised their hand in the chat. Someone called Christopher.
Sorry, Christopher.
Sorry.
Yes, Chris. Yeah. Then go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I just had some thoughts that Harriet, you're talking about how on the one hand there's the botanist who's interpreting nature the whole life but doesn't want to communicate, and maybe it is. I was thinking, is that the difficulty in translating the science into a language that's actually understandable to normal people? It's like maybe some people are very good at learning the language of the science, but the language of people is actually different. And this kind of translation is maybe the hardest part. Do you think so?
Yes, I do. I think it's also that there are some things that you can only learn through feeling, and we're just extremely bad at teaching those person to person because they're so hard, So I think if you're good at climbing trees, for example, because you've learnt it over many years, then that's something which you can't very easily pass on in conversation with someone else. You can show them where to put their hands, but essentially will have had to train their mind into the roots through the trees in a way that they won't necessarily have. Just like when I was staying with some people in the Baré tribe, they were able to kind of see instantly where the trees with the fruit with the right fruit were, and it was just something I had no clue about. And could never understand. But I do think that is one of the really serious things, the translation and the sort of potting an image so that people can understand why it's beautiful. Because I think that's the other thing. Some of the great ecological historians or great scientists are not very good at making their images beautiful in a way that some other people would find them beautiful. I don't know whether it's some sort of quirk in people's nature or something like that, or just that, if you're living your life because the majority of the world lives in cities, and the majority of people who are really studying nature closely will not be living in cities, generally, massive generalization. I think there's also that sort of generally what are your preoccupations sort of link. And so it's easier to watch, Casualty than treesindanger.inc protect them from fungus. I think it's a really good question though, and surely it's a bit like, I suppose it's a bit like the left wing now currently trying to find a really good language to counter popularism or to bring their own popularism to life in a non-right wing way. It's something where we just don't seem to have the language for it, and perhaps it's time to a new one. Are you a scientist, Christopher?
Yes, I work at the Nature Institutes of the West Fjords.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I'm sure you're brilliant at translation.
I don't know.
Magdalena was, I think, trying to stop us. Magdalena, sorry, you're muted again. Sorry.
I muted myself again, and I was trying to jump into the conversation to say that yes, Christopher is definitely brilliant, but Harriet and Asta, I think your participation today was brilliant, and you're translating trees or translating humans for trees. Was really inspiring, and I wanted to thank you both so much for being here today. It was a pleasure. It was an honor to have you be our guests for our opening event here at Media for Future. And I had promised that we would send the information about the Genius of Trees in the chat. As that did not work, we will send it via email to all the people who participated here in this event, and we will also add your website, Asta, so that people with a little more time can take a look after your brief description. Okay?
It is a challenge to update it. I haven't done anything on it for 5 years.
So then it will be a challenge for you to update it.
It still looks great. Highly recommended.
And I hope that we can continue this dialogue, that we can invite more people to our dialogue, and wish you all a nice afternoon for some, evening for others. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for being here.